Okay, thanks, Soph. So welcome everybody. My name's Sandra. I'm here with the rest of our AMSIG committee. We've got Susan Butt there. You may see her in the gallery. We've got a couple other committee members who are joining us a little later. Good to have you all here. If you're new, welcome. If you're an oldie but a goodie, welcome back. We asked Paul to run this session today on everyday ethics in ELICOS. So I'll just give you a little bit of background. So Paul's academic coordinator at RMIT. You might already know him. Apologies if there's a bit of background noise here. I'll soon turn my mic off. RMIT English Worldwide down in Melbourne. Paul's taught business, general, academic English for more than 15 years, Paul. Is that right?
Yes.
Over 15 years now? Beautiful. And so Paul's interested in all aspects of English language teaching and management. He's completed a few postgrad courses, including the Delta, the IDLTM, an MBA at CQ. So he's actually quite well prepared, well steeped in the theory as well as the practice. So Paul's really passionate about English Australia, about contributing to AMSIG, to the sector as a whole. He's done action research in the past. And he's also been in the, or still is, sorry, in the Victorian chapter PD committee. So I'm going to hand over to Paul at this stage. And Paul, you might give us a little bit more housekeeping if needed, but from what I gather here today, we're filming Paul's sections, but then when there's breakout chat, the filming will stop. Sophie, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. We'll pause the recording when we go to the breakouts.
Beautiful. Okay, so the purpose of that, of course, everyone, is to make you feel as comfortable as possible, to chat with your colleagues. Of course, everything that happens at AMSIG stays in AMSIG. You know the drill. And I'll hand over to Paul. Thanks again so much, Paul.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Sandra, and welcome everybody. This presentation came about partly because I really became passionate about ethics when I was doing the MBA, and it occurred to me that I hadn't really discussed or learnt anything about ethics through my work in it as an ELICOS teacher. Hadn't really been involved in any PD about ethics, and or really even thought about how the theory of ethics applies to ELICOS specifically. So that got me interested in thinking, well, what aspects of ethics do apply within ELICOS? And I'd say pretty much everything. But I was also really interested in ethics because I think it applies to our personal lives, it applies to our professional lives, to relationships that we have, to education, to really everything. And so it's about thinking what can we take from other fields of learning and apply to our own professional practice. So today we're going to be looking a little bit about what ethical decision-making principles are, like just in general. Then we'll focus on some the three main moral philosophies that I'll be looking at today is utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. There are others, but I think that this will give us a fair range of thoughts and ideas and sort of contrast some of these philosophies. We'll also look at critical thinking and decision-making, how that applies to managers within ELICOS institutions, whether that's private or public, whether it's universities, for instance. And we'll look at some practical scenarios. And I want to give participants in this session a lot of time in those breakout rooms to discuss really common situations that perhaps we don't often think about as being ethical scenarios, and break some of those down and share some thoughts and ideas about how we apply critical thinking, how we apply ethical decision-making when we're making these decisions. So I don't want to, this is not a top-down or a right or wrong kind of approach. It's much more of a, let's look at ourselves, look at how we make decisions and think about how other people make decisions and how that impacts on staff, students, our institutions, etc. So what are ethical decision-making principles? I've gained this one from Paul and Elder. It's in 2014, which looks at what ethical critical thinkers are. And they provide this list. And I thought this was a good way to start looking at the issue. So critical thinkers, ethical critical thinkers, question their own views. So in other words, we question what assumptions we are making and think about, well, why do I believe this? Why am I making this decision? We also empathize with other people. So empathize with our staff, with our colleagues, with subordinates within the organization, with our teachers, with students, for instance, to see their viewpoint, to see their perspective on things. They reason dialectically, which means that, you know, we look at contradictions or different ways of looking at things and think about some of the strong points or the weak points for those different perspectives. And we can either accept or reject a particular position based on the evidence that is presented to us. We're also open to change and to challenge our own views by thinking without bias, or at least questioning what bias might be influencing our decisions. And I guess the whole goal is to make sure that the decisions that we're making are equitable. If it's not possible to do something equally, then how do we balance that out, and how do we make sure or justify our decisions, for example? So now let's look at some of the moral philosophies. Now, I mentioned before utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is one type of teleology, which is also referred to as consequentialism, according to Farrell and Frederick, and MacDonald as well. Now, egoism, if we think about egoism, this is kind of like, you know, you've probably heard words like egotistical. Well, it's focused on the self, and it's really about increasing utility or benefit for ourselves. So in the past, there were some people who felt that, you know, if you concentrate on increasing the benefit for yourself, then that could be good for humanity, for example. Utilitarianism is very different to that, in the sense that it's still about the consequences of the decision, but it's about maximizing utility for everybody, not just the self. And deontology contrasts with that, because it's not a consequentialism sort of approach. It's looking more about how we make decisions. And the idea is that if we're making good decisions, if we're making the right, just decisions, then the outcome should be the best outcome that we can achieve, for example, right? That ties in quite closely with more recent approaches to moral philosophy. So justice, for example, contrasts duty with right. So when we think about a position, for example, the position of a director of studies, for instance, there are certain duties. That's the role, the responsibilities of that role. But at the same time, they have the right to make certain decisions that others would not have the right to decide. Now, justice also links in with things like our justice system. So judges, and how do they make decisions about whether or not a person goes to jail or not, whether or not it was, you know, manslaughter or murder, for example. So that the idea of justice as a moral philosophy is that there are these things that are morally right and things that are morally wrong, but there's also a certain amount of responsibility that goes with power, for example. Now, Virtue ethics, as the name would imply, is about virtues. So virtues are slightly different to the idea of rights. I could add too, rights also includes human rights as well. But virtues are more things like honesty, integrity, trust, for instance. And a virtue ethics approach is kind of like, if we think about the vision statements of an organization and what values it chooses to be the core of that organization. So no doubt any organization wants their staff to be honest, truthful. So a virtue ethics approach is looking at those virtues. What is considered virtuous and what is considered not virtuous, and how do we encourage people to do the right thing? Relativism refers more to things like what is right and wrong in different cultural contexts. So, for instance, the laws in some countries are different to the laws in others, and what is considered right in one society may be considered wrong in another society. So is there one universal system for what is right or wrong? Relativism would suggest that actually it depends a little bit on the context that you're in. Okay, so let's focus in on this concept of utilitarianism and think about how it applies to ELICOS. So if we look at the definition from Farrell and Friedrich, 2015, they define utilitarianism as a right or acceptable action as those that maximize total utility or greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, you might know about the trolley, how can I put it, the trolley scenario, where if the trolley goes in one direction, one person will certainly die. If it goes into a different direction, 4 or 5 people will die. So what do you do? And the concept is, you know, somebody has to make that decision. And if you choose right, to turn right, then more people would die. If you choose to turn left, then less people would die. Well, utilitarianism would aim to reduce the number of people dying. Now, this happens, this doesn't happen every day, and this doesn't happen to us in ELICOS, does it? So how does it apply to an ELICOS situation? So let's think about scheduling. So if we are going to maximize the benefit for all our staff, how can we do that? And I would say that what I've seen in ELICOS institutions and in discussions that I've had with directors of studies and managers, I think most of us want to find a win-win situation. We want to make sure that all of our staff are happy with the hours that they're getting, with the level that they're teaching, the kind of mode. Now, you know, now we're all going back to face-to-face, but certainly over the last few years, there've been some teachers that are happy to teach online, others that prefer face-to-face, some that don't mind hybrid, others that won't go near it. And sometimes you have to think about, you know, the co-teacher situation. Sometimes some teachers prefer to work with one person that they know well, and other teachers don't mind who they work with. So utilitarianism would look at this issue from a point of how do I ensure that as many staff are happy with that schedule as possible? Now, there may be different ways of doing that, right? How do we achieve a win-win situation? Looking at professional development, how do we fairly distribute budget? Sometimes if you've got a budget of, let's say, $5,000 to spend on conferences, you might have to choose to send only 2 people to a conference if you're going to pay all of the fees for those 2 staff members. There may be a different way of doing that. And how sustainable is this? If one staff member is doing a lot of work, is it fair to send them, or should we base it on the operational needs of the organization and say, well, actually, this is in the best interest of the organization if we send these 2 people to this conference? It may be possible to send no one at all and use that budget in different ways. We might think about equity in terms of, should we divide it up and allow 10 people to go, but only provide 10% of the cost? And what about loyalty? If people are there for a long time and they've missed out in previous years, should we give them some kind of preference or some kind of benefit there, right? Now let's contrast that with deontology. Deontology focuses on the preservation of individual rights and on the intentions associated with particular behavior rather than on its consequences. So is that behavior, is that idea, the decision, is that the right decision, rather than thinking about what's going to happen if we choose this option? So when do we take this into account? Well, I would argue that in assessments, for example, we want to ensure that our assessments are reliable, that there's standardization across different campuses. We need to make sure that we're piloting our assessments and that we have a multi-campus approach if you have centres in different parts of the world or different parts of Australia, for instance. The aim here is to ensure consistency. Now, if we think about it, sometimes we have cohorts of students who are better at writing, better at reading, better at listening, for instance. Should we take that into account? A deontological view would think about, well, how can we ensure that whatever decision is made, that we're always applying that equally to every person? But maybe people aren't always equal, right? So special consideration is another example where we actually need to balance things out for people that are not on an equal level in that sense. When we think about a person who has a particular, maybe they have autism, maybe they have problems with their eyes, maybe they're partially deaf. What changes do we make to the assessment, for instance? However, we also want to assure accessibility. So every student should be able to get into the classroom. Every student should be able to participate in an assessment. What if somebody's hurt their hand and it's their right hand and they write with their right hand? Should they be allowed to type, for instance? So we make adjustments to assessments sometimes based on special consideration. And we want to enable people that would otherwise be disadvantaged by something else, whether or not that's a mental health issue, whether or not it's, what do we call it? Compassionate and compelling a case for a student. Okay, the other one I wanted to talk about just briefly is virtue ethics. So Paul and Elder contrast virtues to vices. So virtues are kind of like the positive behaviors and actions, such as humility, sense of justice, perseverance, fair-mindedness, empathy, autonomy. And if you look at these two images, you can see how they are opposites of each other. So, for instance, intellectual humility is the opposite of intellectual arrogance. Laziness is the opposite of perseverance. Empathy is the opposite of self-centeredness. So when we're making decisions in an organization, I would imagine that most managers want to increase the positive behaviors or virtues over those things that result in these vices. Now, this can be a real challenge when you have problems with engagement or perhaps staff that are low in motivation. That's when you're going to have these problems with vices. We need to be able to encourage people in positive ways to be honest, trustworthy, etc. How do we do that? So this is a different perspective. Rather than simply looking at our role as a manager to make decisions, how do we bring along our staff and as a team work towards these virtues or goals or the values that your organization chooses? Okay, that's enough for me for a little while. What we're going to do now is discuss a particular situation. So here, this is related to a scheduling issue. So I'll give you a moment to read this in a second. So we've got an experienced teacher versus a teacher that's performing at a really high level. And if you look at the multiple choice question there, I want you to read through the scenario and then think about what you would do. Would you do A, B, or C? Okay. So just want to give you 1 minute to read through the scenario at this point and then decide A, B, or C. Think about your reasons. And then I'm going to put you into a breakout room so that you can chat with some other managers or coordinators, for example. Have a chat about what you would do and why.
Paul, we might want to advise people to take a quick screenshot as well.
Yeah, good point. Yes, thanks, Sandra. So just out of interest, it'd be interesting to see in the chat box, what was your decision, A, B, or C? And maybe just quickly type one sentence or just a few words. Why did you choose A, B, or C? So if you could just take 1 minute or 2 minutes to write in the chat box, it'd be interesting to compare what you discussed in your group. These decisions? Well, Paul and Elder also mentioned 3 basic functions of the human mind, and that sometimes when we're making decisions, we are, and some people do this more than others, right? So some people use the thinking part of their brain. In other words, they try to judge and evaluate and analyze the situation. And when they feel like they've got the right decision, then they'll have a clear justification. However, sometimes we have that sort of feeling approach. So sometimes we might feel something towards a particular person. We might like them more than another person, for example, and that can influence us. Is one person really jovial and is just a pleasure to be around? Or do you kind of think about the goal of your organization and think about, well, hold on, what am I deciding here? We need the best teachers. We need to have the people who are performing at the highest level. And maybe that's even part of the organization's values. So all 3 of these, thinking, feeling, and wanting, are integrated within our minds. And sometimes when we're making a decision, we know why we're making that decision. We know that we are making a decision purely because of our emotions. Sometimes we're not aware. So I think that it's important to be self-aware and know what is driving your decision making. Another concept that I like came from Kellett in 2014, who approaches it from a different angle. So that is that this sort of problem solution kind of approach. You start with, well, what is the problem? Well, the problem here is that perhaps there's only one possibility, and you have 2 teachers and you can only give it to one. Well, what do we do there? And remember, one person said, it depends. Well, yes, absolutely. It depends on the context. And to gain a better understanding of that context, we need clarity. We need to understand more about the situation, more about the problem. What's the issue here? What are we trying to achieve when we're making this decision? Once we've got all of that information, we should be clear on what the problem is. From there, we can start to reach our conclusions. That is, thinking about different possible solutions, because sometimes there's more than one. It might be possible to split the shift. It might not be. It might be possible to give somebody hours this shift and then next shift give the hours to a different person. And then from there, we start to make our decisions and take action. I also like this one from Khaled where, and I've used this in my classes too, you know, where the decision-making process, we start with our facts, our observations, our experiences, and that forms our assumptions. Now, when I talk about assumptions here, I'm not talking about like, we often think of assumptions as being a negative thing. Oh, he assumed that blah, 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 blah. In other words, the person didn't find out the facts to begin with. Here, assumption is this concept of the thoughts that we have initially when we observe something happening in front of us, or when we're given certain facts. We start to formulate ideas in our minds. These are they're not yet filtered ideas. And so take this example of Daniel, for instance. Now, if you were to be the person who wants this high-performing teacher, you might look at the facts and think, well, I've been given the student experience surveys about all your teachers, and Daniel's doing really well on his student experience surveys. You might look at the results of the students and think of those as being facts, like objective facts. You may have actually observed the teacher teaching. So you've been in and you've seen a snapshot of that teacher in one given time. Now, that's not a fact because we don't observe our teachers for the full course, do we? But we can at least get an idea from observations, from the examples of what's happening in the classroom or what students are saying about a teacher as well. And then we have our experiences. So you might have bumped into Daniel in the hallway and you've seen the way that other teachers relate to Daniel. This formulates this assumption. We might start to think, hey, Daniel's a really nice person. He's a really good teacher. Yeah. And then that gets filtered by this idea of beliefs. Well, what do you believe about teachers and performance? You might think that if your teacher is getting good results and getting the students like them and that other teachers like them, that's what makes good teaching, right? Now, I would point out that not all people would necessarily believe that. So that is a belief. That's and that filters all of those experiences, all of our facts and observations, goes through this sort of filter and forms our conclusions. So the conclusion is at the decision stage. Well, should I put on Daniel or should I put on the other teacher, for example? You could do this with the other teacher and think about the facts for them and your observations of the other teacher. You know, they're always there. They're always on time, for example. And that might influence your decisions as well. Okay, so we're going to get into 3 other scenarios, and I want you to think about that now. I want you to think about what is going through your mind when you're deciding. And if you do choose an alternative response, think about what that would be and how you would make that decision, okay? So once again, looking at A, B, C, read through the scenario. This time we're looking at academic misconduct and deciding whether or not a student should pass or fail. So look at the scenario. We'll put you in a breakout room again, and then you can discuss with the other managers and people in your room about what you would do in this situation. Okay, once again, take a snapshot because when you go into the breakout rooms, this information, it's hard to sort of share in each of the breakout rooms. So just, you can get your phone, take a quick snapshot, or even just take a screenshot of on your device if that's possible. So we're going to go straight into the next scenario this time. Certainly, when in the group that I heard, there were some different views this time, and consensus that it's really hard to decide. So that's good. It shows that we need to think about these situations and be careful about the decisions that we're making. So for the next scenario, this one's about budget constraints for professional development. I mentioned this a little bit earlier before, but have a look at this scenario. Think if you would choose A, B, or C. Once again, take a bit of a screenshot before we put you into the chat room. And we'll give you another 5 minutes to discuss this scenario. One last scenario. So for the last scenario, we're looking at facilities. So in this case, access to technology. You may have experienced something like this where perhaps not all classrooms are equal. So I want you to think about how you would share access to technology within your centre so that, you know, all teachers get a bit of a chance. So look at the scenario, think about what you would do in this situation, and I'll put you back into a breakout room for another 5 minutes. All right, take a snapshot and we'll open up back, everyone. Look, that wraps up the session for today. I hope that you've enjoyed interacting with the other managers and sharing your thoughts and ideas. There is, hopefully what's been clear from this is that there's not so much a right or wrong way of doing things. It's more about raising our own awareness about what the drivers are that are influencing our decision making, and thinking about, you know, what is the influence? Why are we making a decision? Is it simply to make things fair and equal for everybody? Or are we more thinking about the objectives of the organisation or the values of the organisation that we work in? Or perhaps sometimes are we driven by our own emotions and how we feel, or things like more subjective feelings about our situation. So hopefully this has been a good introduction to the idea of ethics and how it can be applied within ELICOS management in particular. And if you've enjoyed this session, hopefully we can look at this kind of field in more detail in other ways in the future. So thank you for coming, and we'd also be interested in getting some feedback from everybody that attended today, so that can hopefully inform future sessions as well.
Paul, thanks so much. That was an excellent session, and I think it's really representative of why AMSIG exists, which is we're often having these conversations on our own, in our own heads, whereas you can tap into a group like this and share ideas, and you know it will be safe, and you can hopefully swap best practice and nut things out together. So to wrap up, guys, join the Facebook group, join AMSIG if you haven't before. Really quickly, the Academic Managers Brekkie is taking place at the conference in Sydney. Now you can actually attend the Brekkie without necessarily the conference having a conference rego. So the Brekkie itself costs $85. It starts at 7:30, goes to 8:50. Don't worry, there'll be coffee. So that will slap you awake. If you're keen on attending, please do. The AMSIG committee will run the session. Email Sophie, correct me if I'm wrong there, Sophie. Email Sophie if you're keen on attending. And I'd just like to ask the committee to give everyone a wave. So we've got Paul, as you know, we've got Paula from Adelaide, Uni Adelaide, we've got Susan from ILEC Melbourne, we've got Tony from CET Sydney. So thanks for joining us, everybody. We'd love you to come again to future AMSIG events. Over to you, Soph, if there's anything you'd like to wrap up with.
No, just a big thank you to the committee and to Paul especially, and to everyone for coming. Great to see you.
Beautiful. Thanks, everyone. Take care.